you for Art Basel for inviting us to do this panel here. Thanks to our speakers for coming and agreeing to be here. Unfortunately, Henri Sala has not arrived yet. As many of you know, he has been involved with the theater production at Theater Basel, Il Tempo di Postino, and is still recovering. But we hope that he is going to join us while we are talking here. So today's panel is going to revolve around the question of how to collect performance art. How can we collect performance art as a time-based and ephemeral art form? How can it be exhibited, stored and collected? What are the challenges, risks and opportunities that lie within the idea of collecting performance? And how can a performance from another time period be experienced and represented? And I have a very distinguished panel here to my left. I would like to introduce the speakers. Klaus Biesenbach, who is right next to me. He's the chief curator at the Department of Media at the Museum of Modern Art and also the chief curator of the Department for Performance Art. He has been the founder of the Kunstwerke in Berlin, as well as the founder of the Berlin Biennial, which I had the pleasure to co-organize with Klaus in 1998, and since 1999 he's also the chief curator at the PS1 Contemporary Art Center. Next to Klaus is Rosalie Goldberg. Rosalie Goldberg is an art historian, an author and curator based in New York. Rosalie Goldberg has pioneered the study of performance art with her seminal book Performance Art from Futurism to the Present. She is the founding director and curator of Performa, a biennial performance and time-based art event exhibition festival. Rosalie has also been the curator of The Kitchen in the late 1970s, where she organized the first exhibitions of such acclaimed artists as Cindy Sherman, Jack Goldstein, Sarah Levine, Robert Longo, and David Salle. And then all the way to the left is Robert Wilson, who almost needs no introduction to most of us. I just want to briefly mention, of course, Robert Wilson is a theater director and visual artist, also based in New York. And Robert is probably one of the key protagonists in the development of what is generally referred to as post-dramatic theater, which is a form of theater in which the core element of theater, the dramatic text, is decentered, and other elements of theater are allowed to move into the foreground. In the late 1960s, Robert founded his company, the Bert Hoffman School of Birds, with which he staged some of the most radical and innovative theater productions of the early 1970s. Most well-known among those are The Times of Joseph Stalin, which he produced in 1973, A Letter to Queen Victoria, 1974, as well as the large-scale opera Einstein on the Beach, which he produced together with Philip Glass in 1976. Robert has worked also a lot in Europe in the later part of the 70s and 80s, and many of you might be familiar with his European productions, Death, Destruction, and Detroit, and particularly The Black Rider. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. And I just wanted to perhaps start with a little introduction to the subject of performing arts and collecting performance arts. And as many of you know, performing arts and performance in itself has had a sort of comeback over the last couple of years. We have seen many museums devoting departments and specialized curators to the collection and production and presentation of performance art. As you can see here in the example of the Museum of Modern Art, a new department has been installed, and I know that Tate Modern, for example, is also putting substantial resources towards the exploration of this medium. In addition to this, there has been a lot of new books being written on the subject, and a number of institutions have also specifically looked into the idea of how to archive performance, or how to restage or live these performance experience. Just wanted to mention two of those events that took place. A little bit of history repeated at the Kunstwerke in 2001, as well as a short history of performance, which is a series of restaged performances at the Whitechapel organized in London starting in 2003. So before I start now, I just wanted to set out with a quote by Fergie Fallon from her book Unmarked, The Politics of Performance, published in 1993, where she says that performance cannot be saved, recorded, cannot be documented, or otherwise participate in the circulation of representations of representations. Once it does so, it becomes something other than performance. So the question, I think, for us really is, how do we collect performance art? Because when we speak about collecting performance art, we mainly look at the idea of collecting a documentation of performance, whether this is a film, a video, drawings, or maybe instructions that are given to the museum or the collection by the artist, or maybe also participatory works. And maybe we could start with Rosalie telling us a little bit about the whole history of how performance has been collected, or what kind of ideas there have been in the past regarding this subject.
Can you hear there? Yes. And the job of the historian, of course, is to take us back in time a little and to show, in fact, that this is performance art, if you want to call it that, has been around for at least 100 years. If we go back to the Futurists and Dada and really start right there. And I took a few notes a few days ago to just see what people were paying for. Time is slow, as we discovered last night, Il Postino, the time of the postman. And so 100 years ago, a night like last night would have happened at the Salle Gaveau in Paris in 1920, where the seats were 2 francs up to 20 francs. That consisted, again, very much in the spirit of last night, of a lot of different artists coming on and doing all kinds of fabulous things. Really, actually, a lot of it provoking the audience in some way or another. They even had a race between sewing machines, various people on stage doing sewing machines. So the idea of artists stepping outside of the museum, stepping into the variety theater as the Futurists did, all of these are extraordinary precedents and very radical, and they remain radical today. And I think the most radical thing about them is how little is still known about this work. We just get moving into the 50s and 60s. We're really looking at people like Yves Klein, who's immediately starting to sell empty spaces to people, or selling a spirit. He's doing an exchange of spirits in 58, 59. He's actually, you can buy a spirit, and then he actually took the spirit in the form of gold leaf and threw it into the Seine. 61, we come to the great moment when 59, still we're looking at Piero Manzoni, who's actually signing people and saying, you know, you can have a certificate, I'm going to declare you a work of art. So again, this idea of there being a monetary exchange around performance, the irony of it, but equally in fact at that point probably a specific comment about the nature of exchange and how that works, and that when you buy a piece of art, what do you get? And Manzoni's saying, yeah, buy a piece of art and I will sign you and declare you a piece of art forever. And there were different certificates that you could get, red, green, yellow. Red meant that you only were a piece of art, you know, when you were eating or something like that, or sleeping or doing other kinds of strange things. So there were all these different categories. And then Manzoni really turned that upside down by actually going to the artist studio and canning cans of shit and selling those. And actually I just looked up the prices. The highest price for a can of shit was this year, in 07, $135,000, almost $140,000. So that was pretty interesting. And so moving again through that history, there's been this idea always that there's a play on for sale, not for sale. In fact, I see Joan Jonas sitting here, and we did a series in New York called Not for Sale, because I wanted to discuss this idea of the intellectual value and of performance, and that it doesn't have a monetary worth. And Joan, in her quiet way, sort of said, "Excuse me, I want you all to know I am for sale," which I think, again, was a statement about what the artists have to endure in this process. And, you know, we're looking at several parts here. We're looking at this extraordinary history. We're looking at the museum, and then you're looking at the individual. And I think part of the discussion we're going to have to get to is, why does an artist sell the work? And there's also a certain moment when you need to sell. You know, you have to live, you have to actually have an exchange to this work that you're doing. So racing up to the present, I think what we're looking at, as much as a history of performance and the history of the changing idea of what art is, because I think the futurists made that very clear. We take art out of these smelly museums, as they called museums cemeteries. They said they were just these rotting things hanging around, and they didn't want to be lying next to some other rotting piece of fish. And taking art into the street, into the variety theater, into the mainstream. So that's one part of this history we could be looking at, and it's a very, very interesting one, obviously. The other one, as I said, is the artists themselves, and somebody like Joan Jonas or Marina Abramovic had made it very clear, especially in the burgeoning market of the 80s and 90s, as they watched all their students, you know, the Cindys and Robert Longo suddenly making lots of money. It's like, well, why are we still struggling artists and applying for grants? And these kids, you know, our students are raking in tons of money. And it was very hard actually watching these artists who one valued so much, sort of actually not having any funds just to even produce the next work, whereas their students who'd learned so much from them, who were making objects in the 80s and 90s, were doing incredibly well. So we're looking at, as a history of the medium itself, history of the marketplace as it affects those artists and the individual artists. And the fourth really key issue here is the changing role of the museum. Museums are completely different. In the last 10 years, there are other animals altogether. They're these big culture palaces. You know, you go to museums to have tons of people around each other, to really be involved, engaged. I remember going to museums in the 70s, pre-Blockbuster, and you know, there'd be two other people, one cute guy in the corner, and you'd sort of see that person, but the places, they were empty, that was it. And so this idea that you bring lots of people into a museum, you know, Tate Modern totally shifted that. This idea that this incredible space could be a place where, you know, kids are going up and down escalators and getting lost in all kinds of spaces and hanging over balconies and sliding down. That sense of the museum is this incredible palace, maybe going back to a kind of, you know, they mentioned Cedric Price last night, or Peter Cook, in terms of this active city, this building as this active place. So these are some of the issues that I just wanted to kind of lay out as a starting point that, you know, that we're looking at. And finally, this real change in the museum, that we're invariably, if there's this huge crowd coming in to make art, to feel part of this, of course it's time for the museum to pay attention. Two more dates in there. I think 99, I think your show was really incredibly important, a little bit of history. 99, Chrissy Isles establishes her collecting department at the Whitney, and really determines right there and then that they will be collecting performance, and we'll, you know, we're going to discuss here, I think, the difference between collecting the stuff that comes after the performance, but actually collecting performances, preserving the ideas of the artists. And 2004, I think we're looking at the Tate buying the first Tino Sehgal, and now with MoMA is really moving ahead very, very strongly. Just recently bought a Sehgal, recently bought a Laura. Yes, I'm allowed to say that? Laurent Calzadier. So establishing a little bit of history, to quote Jens, just to get us started.
Well, you just spoke about the acquisitions that MoMA has made and other acquisitions by other museums, and I think maybe we could move over to Klaus to talk a little bit about what the strategies of acquisition are at MoMA for performance art. It sort of like seems to me that also the definition of performance art is much, much wider in what you are collecting, because Rosie was already mentioning Tino Sehgal, for example, who is an artist who works with interpreters live in situations, but someone who would definitely say that his work is not performance art. So I guess maybe the term performance art is too generalized for what you do, or maybe the opposite, not general enough. So maybe you could speak a little bit about the ideas that you guys have there at the Museum of Modern Art.
Yeah, said yeah, it's working. I'm actually very happy that Rosalie changed in the last 2 minutes, because I thought I have to speak as a person from that smelly place where one thing is rotting next to the other. We founded a department for performance art, which means that you have a group of trustees that support you with acquisitions, but it also means you have curators, and when curators work, they do exhibitions, so you have exhibitions, collection, then you need somebody who does conservation, registration. It's a whole machinery basically coming into place. And when we founded it, we had 15 different names for the department, and my favorite name was time-based, and then of of course, film said, oh, film is time-based. And then we had a huge discussion, and then we realized, oh, perhaps everything is time-based because we just live through it, right? So we agreed on performance art because we agree that we don't agree. We agree it's not a good name, it's going to be changed again. But I think to have this consensus that we all know possibly maybe what we talk about, and we all agree it's not the right word. It's actually, I thought it was quite a good beginning. What we have at MoMA is 1.5 years ago, we started a workshop, and we have our trustee room, put all the tables together, and it started perhaps with 75 people, and the last one was nearly 150. And it's mostly artists coming, and Joan is here, John Jonas is coming, Matthew Barney is presenting next time, Roman Ondak is presenting, Francesco Vezzoli, Marina Brown, Alfredo Ha, Martha Wilson, Tae-Ching Shea. Like, it's really a very broad group of artists discussing what are we doing, and why are we discussing then, why are we founding a department? Because I think a museum, and that is when you said, oh, MoMA is going full force, we are just confronted with the need to somehow conserve pieces and somehow make sure that they're not sitting there rotting or being forgotten. So I think it's more like an obligation. It's more like, how does a museum make sure it's not forgotten, it's stored, it's preserved, it will be somehow still there in 20 years. And the workshops are really interesting because Tae-Ching Shea, who did the 1-year performances, we had a show with him, the one where he was in a cage for a whole year. And when he performs this in 79, we sit there with all the artists, and curators from Rosie Goldberg is always coming. We have Chrissy Iles from the Whitney coming, Nancy Spector from the Guggenheim. We have, like, it's actually quite surprising that museums sit together when it's not about a Jeff Koons object where you would fight, kind of. It's actually really interesting. All the museums sit there, the Walker Art Center, the Tate, they all participate. So Tae-Ching said, oh, I did this in 79, and she said, was somebody around when I did it? And John Hendricks said, oh, I came, you didn't see me, but I was there, which I felt. It's a unique situation that Tae-Ching is still young enough and around to tell us what we should do with his 1-year performances, how to present it, and then we even have a curator like John who was around at the time. And we do a lot of oral history. It's not always about, this is the object and it's $5 million and we gotta lock it up. It's basically, how do you really make sure that this, if we consider curatorially it's an important piece, how will we make sure that in 20 years it's still presentable in a way? So the workshop, we think, is a good tool to gather information for us to help understand things, and you can ask anything. And sometimes it's actually a very nice inner circle group that the artists sometimes get really angry and said, it's a museum, you never understood what to do with this, and how could you dare to present this without sound or put it into this room, which makes no sense. So it's great actually to have the feedback. When I started working in the art scene in the early 90s, one of the first artists we worked in Berlin with in a group was Joan. Marina Abramovic was one of the first artists. And I remember that when I first worked with these artists, they were called, oh, Joan, she's a great video artist. And I never understood why people say this. And I think in the late 90s, you looked back, when we did the Berlin Biennial, you looked back and you saw so many video projections, Douglas Gordon or Arnold Meek or whoever, Stan Douglas, Steve McQueen, and you looked back and you thought, video projection is a golden frame of the 90s, but of course if you do something, there's always a performance basically where it's based on, and I actually think it's just a name change or it's reconsidering what we're actually looking at, because nobody would call Joan or Marina now a video artist. I remember I found an old letter, like basically describing what certain people do. You would not call them video artists. So now I think it's just re-evaluating what actually the essence of the work is. And Rosalie made a great presentation. I have to do some advertising. Rosalie and I try to make a history of performance art as an exhibition where we will totally fail, because of course we can't do it, but it might be an interesting failure. But Rosalie said whenever something moved in the art scene, if it was a parade, an action, and happening, it was, of course, when it moved, it was some sort of performance, right? And it was always where it really changed, and it was always a cutting edge. So we can't tell the history of the last 100 years with just putting objects next to each other. So I think that's why we founded it. And I quickly make very fast, we did acquire The Kiss by Tino Sehgal, which was amazing for us because you don't get anything. You don't get a contract, don't get a certificate, you're not even allowed to make a photograph of it. And it's a situation where two interpreters, two professional dancers, it's a constructed situation, and the dancers always are in a situation of before, during, or after a kiss. And a kiss they memorize from important paintings or sculptures from art history. So we thought, oh God, how do we present this to our trustees? And we have this big atrium at MoMA. And Tino was very helpful, and he had the two interpreters. And we put them right in the main atrium, invited all our trustees, of course with the audience, because we can't block that. And so there were these two people on the floor. It was completely unclear if this was two visitors gone wild, or it was really very special. We just bought Allora Calzadilla. You might have seen the piece at Barbara Gladstone. It's the Ode to Joy, played on a Bechstein piano with the pianist standing in a hole, like made right through the piano. We bought Roman Ondak, Measuring the Universe, which is another piece that has no object. Just people enter exhibition space and they're measured. So they come in and say, would you like to have your height measured? So it's a first name and a little trace, and it will basically produce a beautiful big wall drawing. We're going to do this for 3 months. So I think it's going to be totally black, the room, after 3 months. And Paul Chen did Waiting for Godot in New Orleans. What do you do with this? This is a process. There are photographs, maps, the beautiful props. One could say it's sculpture. There are 40 hours of footage of what he did. And we said, Paul, that's a fantastic piece. Why don't we work with you 2 years? And we buy the archive. So we have the props, and we have basically everything that is still there from this Waiting for Godot. And I think when you look at from Dara Friedman to all the early works we are now buying, we bought the early Chris Boyden 71, 74 performance anthology, where he typed what he did and had somebody photograph and he signed it. So I see it more as an obligation. MoMA has to do this, because otherwise it's going to be not to be saved anymore in 10 years. And there's no John Hendricks and Tay Ching who will fight what they saw, because it's just, you're just going to be clueless and you find that cage. What are you going to do with the cage?
To bring Robert Wilson into the conversation, and maybe you can help me with something, because you're very specialized, of course, with theater and the performing arts. I kind of think that maybe there seems to be a contradiction in the whole idea of collecting performance art. That's at least what several people have told me over the last couple of days when I was walking around looking at the fair, where you think that performance, through its movement towards disappearance, usually would question and undermine the sort of cultural hierarchies that exist in museums and archives. And now there's actually the question of how to collect those, and Klaus has given us a few examples how this is. And especially when you began working in your field, there were a lot of performing arts artists that also choose this medium specifically in order to escape commodification and really not participate in the market and in the process of the exchange of goods. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your experience of this during the time you began working in theater.
I never studied theater. Actually, I studied business administration in a pre-law program at the University of Texas. Later, I went to New York and I studied painting and architecture in order to support myself. In school, I worked with brain damaged and hyperactive children. And I worked with a woman who had a theory that if an infant did not fully develop in primary stages of physical activity, then his mental readiness to learn was hindered. That often a child who grew up in a playpen or a crowded apartment didn't fully develop in these basic movements of babies. And she had a series of exercises based on observations that she had made on infant movements. A baby looking at his left hand, a baby looking at his right hand, a baby playing with his toes, with his fingers. The most sophisticated movement was a baby crawling. And she would exercise children age 4, 5, 6 to 9 in these movements. Playing with your fingers, your toes, or crawling. And we'd find a child that was having difficulty in repeating a rhythm, a child difficulty opening a door, tying shoes, learning to read, whatever. They're going back and crawling around the room half the size of this 300 times, 5 times a week. After 4 or 5 months, it was easier for them to do whatever and learning. And I worked with her for about 8 months and then decided to break out on my own. And I worked with a handful of children in the early 60s, children with learning disabilities. And I guess it was there that I began to make what might be thought of as theater or performance art or whatever. I made tunnels and streets and parks, textured tunnels where children would crawl inside, and various performances or activities happened inside of these tunnels. And many other things. There was a woman from Harvard who came to observe what I was doing. And she asked me if I would like to go to Harvard and to talk about my work. And I said no, that I didn't really understand, and no. And I had finished school in '65 and didn't know what to do, and ended up in a mental institution. And I spent 6 months in a mental institution. And I got out, and I had no money. I was in Texas. And I went back to New York, and I had a couple of $100 and had no idea what I would do. And I called this woman who was at Harvard and asked her if I could still speak. And she came to New York, and she said, "I'd like to invite you to do 12 lectures." She said, "What is your fee?" I thought, and I said, $800 a lecture. She said, "Okay." Wow, I could live for a year. And I did one every 3 to 4 weeks. And the first one I did, it was to go and to talk about the work I had done with children. I wore a black hood over my head. I had a white hospital jacket and white pants, black motorcycle boots, and a big, thick, black rubber snake that was coiled around my shoulders, the head here, and the tail down my back. And I stood at the podium, and I spoke for an hour and a half about the work I had done with children in Brooklyn. And afterwards, I thought, God, I mean, what will be next? And so she came back and said, "This is fantastic. We've never had anything like this at Harvard. We can't wait for the next talk." In the second talk, I was dressed all in red. And I took Scotch tape and put it on my eyes, and I was a Chinaman. And I had a little plastic box, and inside the plastic box was a dead wasp. And I put the plastic box on the podium and opened the plastic box and took out this dead wasp and spoke for an hour and a half to this dead wasp about the work I was doing with children. And as a result of these talks at Harvard, I was asked to work as an educational consultant in and around New York City. And I worked in private schools, public schools, Head Start programs. I've worked at Goldwater Memorial Hospital, and a hospital in the middle of the East River that geographically was isolated. I worked in a ward with 50 people in iron lungs. This was 1966. I walked in, there was a ward 3 times the size of this room. 50 people in tanks, on legs, with a plug into the wall. Only their heads sticking out of this box. I thought, wow, that's the future. No one can get in that box. They can't unplug that plug. Wow, what an image. Most of the people in the ward were catatonic. They didn't speak. And I'd been hired to encourage them to talk. I did various things with them. One thing I did is I had met by chance Otis Redding, and I asked him if he would come and sing with Carla Thomas to this hospital ward, and he accepted. And I built constructions in the space, like mobiles, and tied strings to the mobiles, and they were connected to the mouths of the patients. And Otis came and sang, and the patients moved these constructions in the room. I worked at Farbrook School, a private school in Short Hills, New Jersey, with children from wealthy families, DuPont children, etc. I gave my first class, I had a suit and tie on, and I had a brown paper bag over my head and a tape recorder. And I pressed the tape recorder, and it said, "Good morning. My name is Mr. Wilson. I am your teacher. And I would like to meet each one of you individually. Could you come to the desk and tell me your name?" So they would come up and say, "I'm Sally Jones." Then I'd press a button. "Very nice to meet you." Anyway, we did various classes with the children. I did one where I wrote for an hour materials on the blackboard. Rocks, glass, water, grass, leaves, paper, etc. At the end of the class, it said you can take a material and select a material and do something with it. I had another class where there was a window to the side of the room that had Venetian blinds, and there was a morning class, and there were instructions for one of the students to play a tape recorder. It was Strauss, and with a stopwatch to pull the blinds up in 10 minutes. And I was outside, it was snowing, and there was a roof of a barn, and I was on the roof of a barn, again in my white hospital pants and jacket with a black snake around me and the black hood. And they listened to music, and I did a performance in the snow on the roof of a barn. Anyway, those were the roots of my work. 1967, I was walking down a street in Summit, New Jersey, and I saw a policeman about to hit a 13-year-old black boy over the head with a club. And I stopped the policeman. I said, "Why are you hitting this boy?" And the policeman said, "It's none of your business." I said, "But it is. I'm a responsible citizen. Why do you hit this boy?" And eventually I left with the policeman and the boy and went to a police station. And on the way, I heard the sounds coming from the boy and recognized them as the sound of a deaf person. And eventually left with the boy from the police station and went to a 2-room apartment where he was living with 13 people. He had recently been sent to New Jersey, and he had grown up in Alabama and Louisiana. And I learned that he was going to be institutionalized, locked up. It was thought that he couldn't learn. I said, "How do you know this boy can't learn?" They said, "We've tested him." And I said, "Could I see the test?" And I spoke with the state psychologist, and after much to do, I was shown the exam, and it was in words. And as far as I could tell, this boy knew no words. He had grown up with people who didn't understand that his problem was one of not hearing. I said, "I don't think this exam applies because it's in words, and I'm not sure he knows any words." I thought he was intelligent, perhaps highly intelligent, and became apparent after a short period of time that he thought in terms of visual signs and signals. And he had no legal guardian. And in 1967, I went to court as a single man to adopt this black boy. And the judge said, "Mr. Wilson, what makes you think this child's intelligent?" I said, "Your Honor, Judge, he has a sense of humor." And that's a sign of intelligence. That didn't work with the judge. I had a 27-year-old lawyer, and I said, "Do you think I'll get this boy?" He said, "No, I don't think so." Towards the end of the proceedings, the judge said, I said to the judge, "You know, Judge, if you don't give me the boy, it will cost the state of New Jersey a hell of a lot of money to lock him up." And the judge said, "You've got a very good point." So they gave me the boy, and he came to live with me. And I made, at that time, I guess the first, what we would call theater, quote, performances. And I eventually made a 7-hour play that was silent, based largely on the observations of this boy, dreams he had, drawings he made. And at that time, I met a man who was head of the Department of Psychology, Daniel Stern, who lives here in Switzerland and Geneva now. Dan was making experiments with mothers and babies, situations where a baby would be crying, and the mother would reach for the baby, pick up the baby, and comfort the baby. And Stern did a very curious thing. He took this 16-millimeter film and slowed it down so you could look at it frame by frame. You could see 1/24th of a second, 24 frames in a second. In 8 out of 10 cases, the initial reaction of the mother in the first frame, the first 1/24th of a second, 8 out of 10 cases, is that the mother is lunging at the child. The child is. The next 2 or 3 frames, the mother's something else, and the child something else again. So that in 1 second of time, it's very complex what's happening between the mother and the child. And the mother, when she sees the film, is shocked and terrified, said, "But I love my child." So perhaps the body is moving faster than we think. And it was these kind of movements that Raymond Andrews, the deaf boy, was more readily reading. I went on from the 7-hour play that was silent and made a 24-hour play that was silent. And then I made a 7-day play that went on for 7 days and nights. And then I made a 12-hour play that went from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning. And again, it was silent. Towards the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s, I was asked to go to Houston to a conference on post-modern theater. I thought, oh my God, what is this? And I was staying in the Four Seasons Hotel, and there was a woman who cleaned the room. Her name was Helen. I said, Helen, can you believe this? The towels, the curtains, the carpet, the bed sheets, the walls, the toilet, the bathtub are all rose in color. She said, oh, Mr. Wilson, they're not rose. They're dusty rose. It's postmodern.
Robert, just before you finish, in your experience as a theater maker, have you thought about how you could archive your own work as a theater director? Are you interested in restaging performances that you did in the past, or do you feel that you need to move forward with new productions based on the experiences of the past?
Well, I think that my early work, one can't repeat it. It was made for that time. It was made with the people of the time.
I mean, I'm probably talking more about like major theater productions.
So that the work at that time was like a shooting star. A 7-day play was made to be, it happened in 72, and that was an event. So we worked for a year and a half for this event, and we did it, and that was it. And we never intended for it to be done again. A work like Einstein on the Beach that I did with Philip Glass, it was a 5-hour opera. I notated everything. Everything was filmed, written down, and it's possible that someone could try to recreate it if they want. Some of the later work, like The Black Rider with Tom Waits, it's being done now. Wozzeck, there's 2 productions of it in Germany. That work is of a different nature. It was notated and can have a future, but myself, I've never been really particularly interested in having the work repeated. I think it's...
Yeah.
Just one last thing is that I remember in the 60s, late 60s, when Lincoln Kirsten said about modern dance, he said, it will have no tradition. And that was, I could understand that.
Well, this idea of recreation seems to be really key to the idea of collecting performances. And I was like wondering if Klaus could maybe speak a little bit about this idea of recreation when you collect performances for the museum, and what is actually happening there between the original performance, maybe a form of score or instructions of a historical performance, and then a recreation or restaging of that performance.
Yeah, first of all, First of all, I wanted to say something when Robert described working with the children, working with the iron lungs, like in these spaces. It felt like a little bit like working in a museum. No, but it's 30 years ago or 40 years ago. You said that was in the early 60s, 66. And I think most of the, you said, oh, there was a baby learning to walk or crawl. There's a beautiful Roman Ondak piece where he confronts the audience with a child learning to walk. And you walk into a space that's a totally empty gallery. There's this little child learning to walk. And you had so many different aspects of not being able to tie your shoes. There is a work in Younger Than Jesus at the New Museum that's about that, about a child trying that. So many of those situations you described, I said, oh, this is this work, this is this work. Within 40 years, somebody made an object out of them. And I felt that experience having unannounced Tino Sgay, The Kiss, the two people in the atrium, it was like really like this confronting, which is participation and perhaps education. And that's why I think we do this as a museum, because we want to have these situations that are revealing and disturbing, and they really change your pace. Because when you walk through a museum today, people don't look like this. They switch on their iPhone, and they look like this. And there's a screen between them. And so, but then you have these two people, and you are not even allowed to photograph them, which I think is great. So I very much enjoyed your description of all these ideas, trying to disturb, to touch, and I think this is really many different works.
It was about living.
Yeah, but art
Learning
should
to
be
walk
about
by
life, I
walking,
think, and that's...
I never thought about it necessarily as, especially in the younger years, as making art.
But I would give one example to Jens' question. I went to Yokohama Triennale last autumn, and the Yokohama Triennale had the theme of time, and many of the people we mentioned were in this, but there was one room I found specifically interesting, and I was actually there with you. We went in, and there was a cut piece from Yoko Ono. This is 1965 in the Carnegie. She sits on the stage, the huge pair of scissors. People can cut her clothes off, and she just sits there without protection. She was already quite a famous artist. She wasn't in that state where she is now, but there sits Yoko Ono, a rather fragile-looking, beautiful person coming from Japan, being in New York. It's a cultural translation, and there she sits totally exposed, and they really cut it all, and there she is exposed. And then this was shown as a video in the Yokohama Triennale on a monitor. You walked in, and on the other side of the room sat Jimmy Robert. Jimmy Robert is from Guadeloupe. He's really tall, and so he, who lives in Belgium, so there is this gigantic, tall male, because I thought about the fragile, beautiful Japanese woman coming in 1965 to the Carnegie. There comes somebody who has a completely different body, a different gender, a different everything, sitting there, and he had Scotch tape. No, it's not Scotch tape, it's this white tape that you use. And he had no t-shirt on, but he had tape, like covering his upper body. And people could walk, and they could just tear it off. And of course, that's painful. But he was also very imposing and quite tall, and he's very present. And there you had Yoko as the documentation of 65, and there you had Jimmy Roberts sits there. And it was, and that's why I say reperformance. That's of course not a reperformance of Yoko Ono. It's figure to style. It's a completely different piece. But I think what we try to do is to translate, and that's just a good example of how different it is. And of course, it's not it, but it's to translate, and it's also perhaps translate not only, also translate in time. You create it, and somehow you try to keep that essence of what that is about being fragile, about viewer aggression, viewer participation. Something is there that's different, but you translate it, and that's perhaps what we try to evaluate with the artist, and ask the artist, if we did that again, Yoko Ono, can we have the score for the cut piece? But if she does it now, she's world famous, there's a history, biography, there's another person that you always associate with her. And if she did it now, and she did it in Paris, but it's very different, right? It's not a fragile young artist. It's a world famous person sitting there. And you have the scissors, and you want to cut her clothes, and it's a very it's different. But some pieces are to be recreated, and some just one little thing. Tino Sgay, he studied economy and dance. You said you studied economy. I think Tino is really thinking about how can this be a visceral, a body memory, a muscle memory. It's basically a little bit like theater or opera being given from one person to the other.
And dance, very much, which I think people forget. Tino actually comes out of the dance world, and passing on a dance in that way is absolutely part of the tradition. Just to add to all these really interesting points, I think we're really entering a new genre, which is the reconstruction. It's really taking on, we're going to all be talking a year from now about, wow, did you see that one when they reconstructed? I mean, 2 years ago we reconstructed a wonderful piece of 18 Happenings in 6 parts, which was first done in Munich, and then we did it again in New York. And it was beautifully, beautifully done and contained a lot of different things. And obviously no one was saying this is still 1959. It's now, 30, 40 years later, yet it carried so much information. And if we can go back actually to the very first quote that Jens read from Peggy Phelan, which I always find such a provocative one, when she kind of virtually says, you had to be there. If you weren't there, the whole thing doesn't exist. And my response is, well, I wasn't at the Battle of Waterloo either, but it still exists. I wasn't at the French Revolution. Some of these things totally change. And as a historian, what we're looking at is, I think it's very interesting that it's now, we look back 30 years, and somehow that's like an art historical okay place to look back and suddenly look back to the 70s. And what museums discover, just coming again to the reason why museums are suddenly, many reasons, but one of the reasons they're suddenly bringing performance back, is they're looking to the 70s and they're suddenly going, most of this stuff was live. It was either instructions on a wall or it was people doing live performance. So suddenly the museums, whether they like it or not, if they're going to deal with the 70s, they actually have to deal with that history. And so that's been very interesting. And then, this idea of documenting the history, my book came out, my original book I wrote in 1979, that's 30 years ago. And I spent so long trying to find all this information that, thank goodness, you at MoMA and the Whitney and everybody is now documenting. So the next piece of history is in fact being established, that you can actually go in and find out exactly what happened. But I say, I really think we're entering a new genre of those who really can reconstruct. It's they're curatorial decisions too. Which pieces work? Can a certain piece work? Can others just not? Like, don't touch that, or it's not going to work. And I think it's a way of, it's a real learning experience in the best sense. It's a kind of live education, which I think we also fool ourselves that most art history is written from the real thing. Most of the time, people write their dissertations looking at slides or looking at 30-foot projections in a lecture theater, and they don't actually see the real thing. So I think this understanding of how much we learn from pictures, how much we learn from that documentation, also has to be passed on to students, to the art historians, to the art critics. Yes, you can look at a photograph. If you look at a photograph from 1970 of Marina Abramović and Ulay, they're black and white. They're very particular photographs. It tells you what's going on. You look at her in 1989, in the early 90s, in the piece from where she's cleaning the bones and the blood. It's clearly a different period. Sorry?
Balkan
Baroque thing. I mean, she's got red painted toenails. No respectable woman would paint their nails in the 70s. You just didn't do that. So these are kind of the art historical kind of iconography that you look for in the photograph. So I think, again, for me, we're looking at a new genre called reconstructing this extraordinary history. We're looking at what it means to read the pictures, learn how to read this material.
Harold Falkenberg did a great job. Recently, he and Peter Weibel and Karlsruhe did an exhibition on the work of Paul Thek. And I'm the executor of the Paul Thek estate, and had been very dubious or doubtful that how to do a retrospective of Paul or how to show Paul's work, because for the most part it doesn't exist. It has disappeared. But they did it with artifacts that we have today, paintings, photographs, drawings. But they did something else in the space that created the, I don't know, I can't think of a better word, it's a poor word, excuse me, the spirit of what Paul's work was about. And they had young people or people who had been influenced by Paul participate in the exhibition. But it was not just, as so often museums do, a morgue collecting the work of a dead person and placing it in a space. But it was somehow more alive. So I think
word life art, when we discussed the department name, Rosalie calls her performance performer, her festival performer. It has the undertitle Visual Arts Performance. So it's kind of coming from visual arts, but then it's performative. And this idea of life art, I think performance art is really a strange word. And it's also very interesting what you identify as performance or not. I'm doing a retrospective of Francis Allies, who I think is a performance artist, because you remember like 500 people shoveling the sand dune, or he running around with a gun until he gets arrested and reenacting this, or having a concert, having the Beatle go up the mountain, and then when the rehearsal, the band makes a mistake, has to roll back. That's, I think, performative. But nobody at the museum said, oh, you're doing a performance exhibition. And I think, oh, I am doing one as Francis Allies. But everybody understands, we're also working on Marina Abramović, a very large performance retrospective. And everybody immediately understands her as performance. And Nancy Spector, with the Guggenheim Museum in 2005, she organized the 7 Easy Pieces, which was basically, Nancy had kind of taken over the middle space in the Guggenheim. There was a Russia show up, so there was stuff up there. And she asked this to happen. Marina had been dreaming about this for quite a long time, to have Joseph Beuys, Vito Acconci, Gina Pane, Wally Export, to have different historical performances. She did reperform them. And the result was like, some I thought were really strong, and some of them I really didn't like. But I thought it was an incredibly courageous act to do this, to say, I'm asking the artist, I'm going to Düsseldorf, I asked Eva Beuys if I can reperform Joseph Beuys, and she did it, and it was clear that it was a reperformance. It's different if a girl or a guy does it. If you do it 30 years later, it was very, very different. But now, doing the retrospective with her, it's so interesting because she found 24 young performers, and they will reperform her own pieces in the exhibition. So whenever you come into the exhibition, there are several couples reperforming Ulay and Abramović. There are several people reperforming, like, think about the piece where she's combing her hair, that's somewhere here at a fair, and you think, why is that on a fair? She's combing her hair and says, art must be beautiful, artists must be beautiful. So there will be, not this piece, but there will be people reperforming always when you walk in. And that's a huge experiment. And so coming back to this, what is the museum's role, and is it the smelly objects, or is it collecting? It's a huge experiment, and perhaps next year we're going to say, oh God, last year we all thought we could do it, and then it really failed terribly.
I think that word performance art is one that I actually ignore completely. I don't know if Joan Jonas would call herself a performance artist, or if Marina Abramović calls herself a performance artist. I think they're artists who also make many, they're very particular artists because they work in a lot of disciplines. Robert Wilson, I think of him as an artist who also works in many different disciplines. I think of his architectural background. I think about all these different things that come to play. I think the term is one, it's much more general. I almost think we've just got to throw it out there and leave it alone. Actually, the term live art, I have to say, came from, which is very interesting. Whenever you're looking for a title and you're having a new book, go to the sales department, because the sales department at Thames and Hudson actually came up with that, which I thought was really good. When my book came out in 1979, and they said, how are we going to tell people, how are we going to sell this book called Performance Art? And they came up with live art. I said, that's terrific, says it exactly like it is. So we'll have that on record where that came from. But I do think, you know, again, and Marina, you know, and Joan are both really leading the way about how to bring back earlier works, and why, you know, and to do it in this remarkable way. And Marina replaying her autobiography, and so she's really been thinking about this as an artist, restaging, rethinking. That's why I say it becomes this next genre of going back into work and really pulling it forward, and yet at the same time she's always making extraordinary new work. I think the two shows next coming up, your show with Marina at the Guggenheim and Tino Sehgal at the Guggenheim are going to, did I say Guggenheim? Sorry.
Yes, one is at MoMA.
One is at MoMA. Your show at MoMA, Marina at MoMA, Tino at the Guggenheim are really, this whole discussion is going to be very, very strongly established about the museum, performance in the museum. It's going to be a remarkable moment in time that really brings this discussion into a very, very public realm. And also makes it very understandable. I think it's going to be very understandable.
I probably should not have agreed to do it, but I'm going to try. And Klaus, I should really work with you on it, but to stage the life and death of Marina Abramovic as an opera. And we're going to do it in Manchester and hopefully elsewhere. And it's, Marina asked me to do it, and I kept sort of avoiding meetings with her or talking about it because it was something I didn't feel comfortable doing and didn't really want to do. And last year she called me. I was in New York. I'm never in New York. I live in New York, but I'm never there. And I was there for a couple of days. She said, I've got to talk to you. I've got to talk to you. I said, Marina, I'm seeing doctors. I have no time. I've got to talk to you. I need 3 hours with you. I said, I don't have 3 hours. I'm just here for 2 days. I haven't been here in 8 months. I've got to talk to you. I've got to talk to you. So I went to her studio and she said, you have to stage my funeral. I've been thinking about it now for weeks and weeks. And please say yes. Don't say no. You'll stage my funeral, yes? I said, I want to be buried in Belgrade and Amsterdam and New York, a funeral on the same day, 3 bodies buried. No one's going to know who the real Marina Abramovic is. Please say yes. So I said, that's how we could open your opera. So we're going to try to do it. And she said, oh, that'll be great so I can see it. So we'll walk in the theater, it'll be the funeral of Marina, and maybe myself.
I think what's most fascinating from what I've heard this morning is really this idea that we are really at the beginning of an examination of how to deal with performance in regards to the collection in the archive, and that there's still a lot of confusion, but that's obviously, of course, also a fabulous challenge for us as curators and art historians working in museums of how to bring all of this together, as it seems that traditional tools perhaps are not the right methods anymore to talk about the collection and performance art. So I wanted to conclude with this and open the podium and invite you to ask our panelists questions. So I think we have a microphone also over there. Is there a question here in the front? Well, maybe you start over here on the left side.
Hello. I want to ask you, what do you propose for young performance artists, what to do to document their performance, and how?
We actually had a workshop about the question of documenting, and we completely had disagreement. There were some artists that it's very important that there are objects that are not only props and they're not only remains, because they were the objects that were part of the performance, and therefore they have a different history and you can't exchange them. Then Babette Mangold was there, who I think is a great artist in her own right. I really think she is a great artist. But she also, of course, is a pioneer in documenting other artists' work. So actually, to sum up the whole 3.5-hour workshop, we had no conclusion. And yeah, it's perhaps not helping. I'm sure you know better.
I think that the whole integration of media with performance, it's been really hand in hand almost from the beginning. Again, Joan, thankfully you're here to keep referring back to you, but I know there was a comment from you early on that movement between video and performance was interchangeable, and that the medium, it was kind of totally integrated. And I think, in fact, in the 90s, what we forget is that so much of the photography we see is really coming out of this documentation. Cindy Sherman's early work as performance, and then you can go through a whole, it's really a big section of work that we could call being film or video or photograph. You know, Matthew Barney, what is that work? He's not a filmmaker, he's a man who he's an extraordinary image maker, and he makes the most amazing images, but those films that come out at the end are through this extraordinary performance realm. And on and on. The whole Chinese school that we've come to know in the last 5 years, 10 years, the big show you did at PS1 with the first Chinese show, all that material was performance material. We see the photographs, we see Zhang Wan on a mountain or in a lake, and the fantastic videos. So I think the young performance artist actually uses that as a matter. I don't see a separation. There are very few. I mean, there's a Tina Segal for very specific reasons. There are a couple of artists who will, almost in this purest way, say, no, it's only the performance. I will not document. There are no photographs. But I can't think of too many other than Tina, who's religious about that. The rest will integrate the live and the document and end up with extraordinary documents. Patty Chang, you know, we can go on and on. Amazing documents that come out of the work that stand alone and they're more than records. They're integrated to the work.
But even think about drawings, think about Shiraga, exactly. Think about Gutai. So it's really, and what is so interesting in the museum is we look at a Shiraga painting and say, is that actually more important that it's based on a performative act, or is it more important that it's a painting? But so they're all different ways, and I think that's perhaps that we have all these like iPhones and computers, and younger than Jesus, you basically looking at screens in the whole exhibition. Perhaps that is also changing our way of looking at the world, and so having something that's time-based, has a duration, it's moving, is much more common. It's much more like everyday life, right? So
are muscle-based. I think muscle-based. The memories in the muscle. So, I mean, it's by doing it, we know it, and that can go back from the beginning of time.
The muscle-based explains the Shiraga and the drawing and Trisha Brown and
exactly.
Actually a beautiful image.
Animals, humans.
There was another question here, yeah, in the front. Please.
I'm the director of an art museum from Transylvania region in Romania. And I have a question especially for Mr. Wilson. What do you think about the idea of the museum as stage or as a place for a continuous performance?
Well, I think a stage can be, you know, a child making a dance in a bathtub, or making a dance in a telephone booth, on the street, in a museum. I was fortunate to be a part of a committee in the early 70s with Pontus Hultén when they were forming the Centre Pompidou. And he was so fantastic. He said, I want this museum in Paris to be a center. And he said, whether we do something in the confines of the museum walls, I don't care. If a kid wants to make a dance in a telephone booth, let's support it. Let's not be a museum that's a morgue, that's collecting work of dance people. If we can have performance in our museum, great. But if Robert Wilson wants to do it in a 19th century or 17th century theater, let's support it. If a kid wants to do a performance in a bowling alley, let's support it. It was a real working museum. He said it has to be the #1 center in Paris, a place where people congregate. It was. It became the #1 tourist attraction in Paris, the museum, the Centre Pompidou. Many of those people that congregated around the museum never went inside. Fire eaters and people sitting and talking. The best class I ever had in school was taught by Sybil Moholy-Nagy. She taught a 5-year course, the history of architecture. In the middle of the 3rd year, she said, students, you have 3 minutes to design a city. Ready, go. She was serious. And I drew an apple. Inside of the apple, I put a crystal cube, and she said, what are you thinking about? I said, a city. That the crystal cube is the core, a place where people can congregate. The way in a medieval village, you had a cathedral that was the highest point in the village, a place where people congregated for exchange of ideas, for enlightenment, whatever. That our communities need centers. And it can be anywhere. It can be the Museum of Modern Art. It can be the Centre Pompidou as it became. My first works in video were commissioned at the Centre Pompidou. So I guess, to answer your question, performances can happen in a museum, they can happen anywhere.
There's another question in the back.
Hi. Just taking Tino Sehgal again as a reference and the idea of the oral transmission of performance art, I'd like to ask, and also the idea of the concentration on the artist, on performance that concentrates very much on the aura of the artist and on the artist as other seminal works, or Marina Abramovic. And what happens, how does the artist let the work go? I mean, for instance, Tino Sehgal, I believe he has still some control on the work once it enters the collection. Can you talk a bit more about the oral transmission? How could that be lost without the artist in relation to its artwork? And for instance, if I believe, you know, if the works are always, in Tino Sehgal's case, belong to the memory of certain people, only in the memory of certain people, what will happen in 50 years' time? Will those works transform within time? Can they be lost because they won't remain? The insurance of those works, for instance? Can you?
That depends on the work. And I mean, a work like Einstein on the Beach, the opera I did with Philip Glass, it's copyrighted in two ways. One, someone can try to recreate what I did. It's documented, it's notated, and once it was tried, it didn't really work. Or you can take the concept. The concept was very simple. It's a work in 4 acts. Act 1 is theme A and B. Act 2 is C and A. Act 3 is B and C. Act 4 is A, B, and C. And the A, B, and C are the 3 ways of measuring space as a tradition in painting. Portraits, still lifes, and landscapes. I see my hand here, it's a portrait. I see my hand here, it's a still life. I go across the street, it's a part of a landscape. So the space can be divided in these ways. And you can take this structure, this simple structure, and do whatever, fill it in. So you have a mega structure that's given to you. And then you're free to fill it in. The way Paris is a beautiful city because it has a great architectural plan. So Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, or anyone can build a building within this plan and it works. Architect builds a building and you live in the building and you have an apartment, you can fill it in. There are other works of mine, speaking personally, I think they should never be recreated. It's not meant to. I made early work with a housewife from New Jersey and put it with an intellectual from New York, with a medical doctor, with a child who was from an institution for brain damaged children. It was something, a product of the time. I don't think it works today.
Maybe you should.
Specifically asking about Tino Sehgal also. It's actually not really, it's oral and not. We had Trio A by Yvonne Rainer, reperformed recently. We have the original video footage projected in the main gallery. So there was a Bruce Nauman installation and then a very large projection in the Bright galleries of Trio A by Yvonne Rainer. And we invited the original dancer, that worked with Yvonne Rainer, and we asked 2 younger dance. It's Pat Hackert. She came, and it was so amazing because she said, I worked on it with Yvonne, and then we didn't do it for 10 years, but I love it so much, I always did it. We regrouped 10 years later, Yvonne saw it, and she said, oh, it's completely wrong. Because she had in her muscle memory, it's not oral transmission, it's just her, she had moved away, but perhaps she had been also staying at the original, and Yvonne had moved away. I don't know. It was an incredibly interesting conversation, and then Yvonne, she trained Ian White and Jimmy Robert, who are non-dancers, and TOA is about non-dancers. Everybody can do it if you're really good, so you can do it, and they did it. So the 3 of them did it, and it had differences, but it's about muscle memory. If you don't do it, you lose it, and if you do it too much, you might actually float away. What Tino does, we sat with 12 people around the table. There was a notary, a lawyer, the gallery, a registrar, conservation, 3 curators, and he explains this, and he has these rules you have to memorize and not forget, and I thought I would forget them, but then we sat there for 4 hours, and it's only 5 rules, and so after the 4 hours, you're not forgetting these rules because you discussed this with him over and over and over again, and you discuss why is that rule, and with him, he doesn't let go, you're right. They are certified instructors, dancers, who can train other people and authorize other people to dance or interpret the piece. So you're right, it might, if you don't, I don't want to say the word perform, if you don't organize it every 1 or 2 years, it will be lost, yes. But also a dance is lost if you don't do it. So it's very much in that tradition.
I'm not so sure, though. If you look at the work of George Balanchine, I mean, I was appalled 2 or 3 years after he died to go back and to see this repertory at the New York City Ballet being performed with everyone smiling and looked like Broadway. But, you know, there was only one great choreographer in the 20th century, and that was Balanchine. Maybe Merce, but it's classical, and you can't destroy it. The compositions are so solid. The construction is so solid. Those 100 cubes of Donald Judd in Marfa, Texas, wow, it's like the pyramids. It's classical architecture. It's classical construction, Symphony in the Sea of Balanchine. It's like Shakespeare's sonnets. It's like a rock. You can put it in the middle of a highway and try to roll over it with a steamroller. You can put it in a swimming pool in Hollywood. You can put it on the moon or something. It's indestructible. So I think great works, in some ways, last.
Perhaps we have one more question. Yeah. There's 2 more questions.
Jens, I'm curious about the idea of reproducing performances that were not meant to be reproduced, such as the work that came out of the 50s and 60s and early 70s, that performance was a reaction to the materialist society, and they were not meant to be bought and sold. So reperforming them now without any photographs or videotapes of these things seems a little uncomfortable for me, and perhaps it should remain in oral tradition. What do you think of that?
First of all, I agree, but if an artist wants to try it and just have this as a challenge, the artist should do it. The museum can't just simply do it, I agree, if a younger artist wants to recreate it. And it's a very fine line, because when we get material like an archive, sometimes the archive ends up in our archive, in the library, and not in the storage of the art objects. And of course, Tino doesn't end up anywhere because there is no object. But sometimes it's just a responsibility of information. Perhaps it's just a protocol you have with the artist asking, what did you actually do? Or is this a letter saying, oh, we just did this and it was meant to be this. And it's not always an art object, and it's not always ending up in the collections. It often ends up in the archives, the library. And I agree, if you don't have a legitimate reason to reperform it, I wouldn't do it.
Well, except for, as Rosalie, I know, feels it's important to reperform things, even if there were no valuable photographs or some kind of notation. And I understand her point, and I agree with it also. However, another point is that recently in the Museum of Modern Art, I was there with Sarasi Kusalwang, and he decided to perform in front of the Trisha Brown through the Bruce Nauman, just because he wanted to do it, and I photographed him doing it. And so I just thought it would be an interesting idea for museums to have other artists coming in and performing among the works that are there.
Yeah, he did what we actually had done before, and we invited Simon Forti, Ian White, Jimmy Robert. And I think it's great that others follow, and you do it, I think.
Yeah.
We had actually no, that's kind of not serious, so I'm not. But
Well, the guards didn't bother us at all. They just and people just watched and thought it was quite amusing and probably wonderful that the museum was so open to
we had a
this sort of
person,
thing.
I don't know how you call this, it's not a handstand, but we call it Rad in German. When you do a handstand, but you roll, how do you call that?
Cartwheel.
A cartwheel.
Yeah.
We had a person do a cartwheel through the whole floor. And it was funny because there are more pictures taken every day in the museum than there are exhibited in the museum. Because obviously it's like camera, camera, camera. And this was the most popular thing that day.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
I don't feel that everything can be. Are we on? I don't feel that everything can be reproduced. In fact, I think the comment I made a little earlier was I think some things absolutely must not be. And I think that's kind of curatorial judgment as we all get more experienced in this new genre of reproducing. I think there's really decisions to be made. In fact, I think the one time I saw documentation even of the Joseph Beuys and the Coyote, I actually found myself sort of, it disturbed my idea of the original piece to such a degree that I wished I'd never seen it, because the photographs for me are so poetic and so dreamy and sad and somehow very strong as a metaphor for all the stories that Beuys apparently was telling with this event. And when you see the video of Beuys arriving wrapped up in a blanket and traipsing through, trying to get up the stairs at René Bloch and so on, it trivialized it, and it just kind of looked silly, and the poor animal looked like it was really irritated and didn't want to be there.
But I disagree with this, because you don't
Oh, it's
own
totally
that.
personal, of course. But I'm just saying, when I saw that, it almost made the whole event seem kind of crazy, and not as, in my mind from the photograph, it had this huge kind of mythology about it. So it's a very interesting mix. Sorry. Joan, I think, had a question.
Yeah, there was a question here from Joan.
I think it's important for these discussions to maybe begin with the idea that I agree with Peggy Phelan. You can never experience the original performance, ever. I've seen restagings of many things, which I saw. I was lucky enough to see. And there's always something very different. And for instance, it becomes the person's piece who restages it. And also, it's not a new idea, because things have been restaged in the theater world for centuries, Chekhov, and reinterpreted, retranslated, and so on. So I agree that hearing Bob talk about his work, it's an oral history, and it's very important that was so interesting to hear him talk about how he began, you talk about how you began. To me, that's much more important than ever seeing a restaging of those pieces which he said are impossible, and I agree. So isn't it possible to start these discussions sort of agreeing that they can never be experienced as they were, and then how do we go on, and then to define it from going on from there, that these are actually a different form. I mean, I'm very glad that there's records and evidence of, say, the Butoh dancers that are 5 minutes long, and you get the spirit of something. It's never the original spirit, but some spirit is transferred. And I wonder if you can start thinking that way instead.
Joan, your works are reperformed, Mirror Check is reperformed quite frequently now. It's such a...
It's only been reperformed once. And it was slightly, it's my only work that can be reperformed in that way, probably. But it was different because a different person did it, and she had a tattoo of a snake on her stomach, you know, and that was a whole different, a little different flavor. It was very much the same, but I mean,
Wow.
I'm not attached to the way it really was in the beginning. That's the thing. I'm not attached to having it be that way.
I heard it was actually reperformed recently in some environment in Williamsburg. That I said, "Oh, did you see that?"
Oh,
And
okay.
Yeah. You
Well, that's
you
fine. I
can't
have
control it, right?
Yeah.
I think we have to finish now, but thank you all for coming. And thanks to our speakers and thanks to Art Basel.
Spent so much time with you.